Today, of course, I'll be getting into kind of continuing the French Revolutionary period, which kind of keeps going, I guess, under Napoleon and really afterwards. They kind of have revolutions, I think, in France, a couple of them after that as well. But we'll talk about today the rise of Napoleon, the so-called Age of Napoleon or Napoleonic Era. We'll get into the Napoleonic Wars, of course, that, of course, also affect Europe as well, because Napoleon kind of brings, I guess, Europe kicking and screaming into the modern era, as you know. Anyway, of course, I'm going to go ahead and, like I said, continue talking about, the French end of the French Revolution. You have Napoleon that comes in at that point. Of course, I'll get into, the early life of Napoleon, later Emperor of France, known as Napoleon the First, of course. And I think we had talked about how Napoleon eventually, seized power in 1799. He saw a little short video. He overthrew the Directory and took power and pushed those other men aside. Roger Duco, I think it was, and I always say Abby Sieyès, how I say it. But Napoleon, of course, wasn't just, this general that we hear about. That's very famous. He was also a modern type ruler. He's like one of these first that really comes from like a lower background. I think he was like minor nobility, not from like upper nobility or anything like that. But he, of course, was known as a military genius, had one of the greatest, by the way, military careers in history, like a 30-year career. He was like in the military overall. And I think if you look at Napoleon, like, you can kind of compare him to because sometimes I compare him like Nick Saban, University of Alabama, football, 90% winning percentage. It's pretty much what Napoleon did in like a 15-year period. He was almost unbeatable on the battlefield, except for a couple ones he lost at the end, like Waterloo, of course, it's famous. He's also later nicknamed the Little Corporal. It's like a terms of endearment. Like a lot of his troops kind of saw him as this man of the people, a man worth fighting for, basically. Later, when he was emperor, he was also known as the Petit Empereur as well, or Little Emperor. But Napoleon, the one thing about him is that he was really, not a traditional Frenchman. He was actually of Italian background. Of course, if you know about Bonaparte, he was actually born on the island of Corsica, and his father was like from I guess what we call lower aristocratic background. They believe that the Bonapartes or Bonaparte family, I guess they call it, originated from northern Italy, like where Tuscany is today. Corsica at that time was, being added to the French state, and so that enabled eventually his father to send him to like French military schools, of course, which he would, of course, later. Here's some images, of course, showing his parents, which are right here. Of course, on the left, you have Carlo Bonaparte, and then his wife on the right, of course, is the wife of Carlo, of course, was Letizia Bonaparte. And so I think Napoleon credited really his mother with influencing him the most. I think he saw his father as maybe like a scoundrel or something like that. He didn't really like his father that much, but she definitely had a lot of influence on Napoleon overall. Now, like I said, his father eventually sent him to military schools. Of course, there's a very famous school in Paris that you may have heard of, which is called the École Militaire, which was like the famous French military academy, which was originally founded by the Bourbons under King Louis XV. He did go to this other school before that, which was Brienne-le-Château as well. I think he got to France when he was about 9 or 10 years old. A lot of people make fun of Napoleon because he had this Italian accent. He never really truly, I think, learned French well, but people made fun of him. He's kind of pale-looking kid and all that. But over time, he becomes more interested in like military stuff, military tactics and things like that, which Napoleon will be, of course, well known for later. Also, we've got some other students joining me this morning also as well. Look at Carlette's also joining us as well, Michelle, and also Sophie as well. So we're having a great morning overall. Now, talk about the career of Napoleon. Napoleon, started his career at a very young age. I think at the age of 16 is when he started his military career. He was actually a French artillery officer in the French army. This all started basically before the French Revolutionary Wars, I guess, started out and all that. Like I said, it's one of the greatest military careers in history. 30-year period. And Napoleon is very famous. He started out as a lieutenant at the age of 16. It only took him 8 years to go from lieutenant to general. That's pretty quick overall. Now, he was known for a lot of successes early in his career. One of the first things, I guess, that really made Napoleon was the so-called Siege of Toulon, which was during the French Revolutionary Wars. And this was an event where what happened was the British Navy had come into the port of Toulon, which is on the southern coast of France, and laid siege to it. And this is during the French Revolutionary Wars. And anyway, Napoleon, who I think was a captain at the time, came up with this idea to bring in cannon and fire it at the British ships that were in the harbor, and he was able to basically force them out. And so he helped lift the siege of Toulon, and so that allowed Napoleon to go from I think a captain to a brigadier general at that time. So I think he was only 24 years old. And that was considered one of his first great successes, in the military. That made him kind of somewhat famous at that time. But the thing that really made him a household name, they always talk about, of course, is in October of 1795, with the Directory government being formed after the Jacobins were ousted, after, Maximilian was executed. You have this deal where they had this new constitutional convention that was created, that was being put on at that time for a new constitution of France for the Directory government. And they had a bunch of royalists, several thousand. They were trying to march on the convention, hoping to put in a monarchy again. And so Napoleon, if you know about this, cleared the streets with a whiff of grape shot. I think it was Thomas Carlyle in his famous historical work, The French Revolution, described it as that. And he laid in cannon against the mobs, which is crazy, I know. I think they later called it 13 Vendemiaire from the French Revolutionary calendar. And he killed something like 1,200 royalists that were trying to storm it, I guess. And that made him a household name afterwards. And of course, I talked about Paul Barras, who was head of the Directory government after that. He put Napoleon in as a full general, as commander of the interior of the army. So that's something that he was able to gain because of that. So you look here, with the career of Napoleon, it's pretty quick that he becomes a hero in a matter of so many years. Now, another thing that's very famous about Napoleon, he also met Josephine, of course, who he eventually married in 1796. He was married to her until 1810. And if you know much about her, she was actually the former mistress of Paul Barras. So I met her, and eventually I think the two hooked up. And she didn't really like Napoleon. I don't know if you know this or not, but she cheated on Napoleon several times with other men. But I guess she needed a man that she thought that was important and could, give her a better life. And she was also older than Napoleon, I think about maybe 4 years or so. She was getting old, and so she basically decided to marry him. And she already had two kids, I think a daughter and a son. Her first husband, had died in the guillotine, executed by the Jacobins during the French Revolution. And she was actually a French Creole. She was actually born in the Caribbean, on the island of Martinique. It's interesting about that. So that's basically Empress Josephine. Josephine will be like his first empress consort from 1804 to 1810 when Napoleon is emperor of France. Later, he does have a second wife. He divorces her later because she's unable to give him any children. She's just too old. So later, he marries this other woman named Marie Louise, who was known as the Duchess of Parma. And that was the second wife you see there with actually Napoleon II, which was only Napoleon's only legitimate son he ever had. And she was actually the daughter of the Emperor of Austria, Francis II, who was also Holy Roman Emperor. And so they kind of created this marriage to create like this alliance between Austria and France during the Napoleonic Wars, and all that. I think she liked him, but Napoleon had I forget how many girlfriends he had, but he had like 20, 30 girlfriends, I think, or something like that, and mistresses. So he had a lot of women, Napoleon. So anyway, just kind of talking about some of the personal life of Napoleon that's kind of well known as well. So I'm going to, of course, move on to talk more about Napoleon's military career as well. Now, they have this other thing that's real famous as well, which, of course, is the Italian campaign. That was the thing that really made Napoleon real famous throughout Europe. And what happened was after he married Josephine in 1796, Paul Barras, who you see in that picture on the right, gave him a commission, which is to head up the army of Italy. This was like a ragtag army that the French hadn't really been able to do much with in the French Revolutionary War. And so they were fighting in northern Italy. And so Napoleon was given command of it. And he was able to take this army and make it into like a real successful army, fighting against Austria and also the Kingdom of Sardinia, which was up in the northwestern part of Italy in the Alps, also called sometimes Piedmont, Sardinia as well. And it was very successful. At the time, France was fighting against a coalition of powers. It was often called the War of the First Coalition. They were pretty much fighting everybody, just about, I think, minus Spain. Britain, Austria, Holy Roman Empire, Prussia, Dutch Republic, Sardinia were all aligned against the French and all that. And Napoleon was very successful. His most famous battle was the Battle of Lodi, which happened in May 1796. And it's that battle that Napoleon gets the famous nickname that his troops start calling him, which is the Little Corporal. Everybody started calling him that. You're our corporal. You're a man for us. And they feel like he's this man that Napoleon was this kind of general that would be up there with his men, laying in cannon, things like that, directing him what to do, and oftentimes, almost getting himself, killed, in the process. And so Napoleon was a modernized general. A lot of these generals on the other side didn't know how to fight Napoleon. He'd fight, at night, during the day, snowing, it's raining, doesn't matter. If the enemy's in check, he keeps going at him, things like that. So Napoleon was definitely the type of general that nobody had ever seen before, especially in modern times. So there was a deal afterwards where he actually helped develop a treaty to end that actual conflict, a Treaty of Campo Formio, actually written up by Napoleon himself, which helped end the War of the First Coalition, leaving only Britain left. At that point. And France at that point starts to take control of northern Italy, which Napoleon's going to turn around later when he's emperor and create a kingdom out of it, Kingdom of Italy, which was mostly in northern Italy that you have later. So that kind of makes him a household name. But there's one thing that's very famous about Napoleon, which you may have heard about. He had this really bizarre campaign that he had, of course, in his early career, which is the Egyptian expedition or Egyptian campaign, that they often called it. Here's an image of Napoleon with the Sphinx, of course, there. And what happened was in 1798, the French decided that Britain had to be knocked out of the war also, because they had this so-called War of the Second Coalition that broke out, which Britain was backing. at that time. And they hoped to destroy Britain's trade routes all the way to India, because this area in Egypt was kind of controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and it was actually ruled by the Mamluks, who were mercenaries of the Ottoman Turks. And so what I think was May of 1798, Napoleon's forces set sail from Toulon in France with about 40,000 troops using the French Navy. And they'll basically overwhelm the Mamluks, who really don't have a modernized armies like they do in Europe as a whole. And his troops eventually overwhelmed them near Cairo, so-called Battle of the Pyramids. You may have heard of, which happened July 21st, 1798. And the French just routed their forces badly with very few casualties in the battle. And you can see they're called Battle of Pyramids because of the pyramids of Giza, which are of course nearby at that point. And so that enables the French to basically take over Egypt at that time, 1798 to about 1799, that the French kind of controlled it briefly. And when the French are in there, they start to kind of modernize the country, kind of bring some of Napoleon's ideas into Egypt. But also they begin studying a lot of like ancient Egyptian artifacts. In fact, they think that Napoleon helped to start what we call modern Egyptology afterwards, and kind of bring a lot of interest in Europe on what the Egyptians were before. Because Napoleon once said, if you go back to that famous picture I was showing, that painting of Napoleon, he said to his men something like, "That's 40 years looking down upon you, 40 centuries that's looking down upon you, right there with the Sphinx." And so he really believed that the Egyptians had various secrets, ancient Egyptians that people need to know about or study about. And so it led to a lot of interest in that. Of course, when they were in Egypt, one of the big things that'll happen, of course, that's real famous, is they do discover the famous Rosetta Stone. That's one thing that's well known, about the Egyptian campaign. There was a soldier named, I think his name was Pierre Bouchard, and they found this stone that was inside of a fortress. I think it's called Fort Julian, which was in the Nile Delta. It was a town in the Delta called Rosetta. They pulled it out of a wall, and it weighed like about half a ton, about 1,000 pounds. And they, of course, call it the so-called Rosetta Stone, as they dub it. And the Rosetta Stone was real important because it really later led to the deciphering of hieroglyphs, which at that time was a dead language. And I don't know if you see that man right there on the bottom right there. That's Jean-Francois Champollion. He was one of the first men to actually translate the Rosetta Stone. It's actually considered one of the early fathers of Egyptology. Very, very interesting about that. Of course, the stone now is in the British Museum today in London, but it is considered one of the most famous things that I guess Napoleon did, in Egypt with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. They did start doing like studies on a lot of the pyramids and tombs and things like that as well when Napoleon, entered Egypt as well. Now, things did not go well for Napoleon in Egypt. If you know about this, after he entered Egypt, what happened was his force got trapped in Egypt between 1798 and 99 because the British, their naval forces, found out where the French fleet was that was there that Napoleon used to, get to Egypt and all that. And so what is Albuquerque Bay, which is in the Nile Delta, Horatio Nelson went in there with his fleet and attacked them. This became known as the so-called Battle of the Nile that occurred. It's really considered one of the most famous battles, naval battles, the Napoleonic Wars. That and the Battle of Trafalgar, which you may have heard about, 1805 as well. And anyway, on August 1st to 3rd, Nelson's fleet captured or destroyed 13 of Napoleon's ships that were part of his fleet. I think it took out majority of them, just about. I think he maybe had 3 or 4 left, and that basically left him trapped in Egypt. Napoleon did do some other things that most people don't know about also as well. He did invade Syria. I don't know if you know about this, but in 1799, he sent his forces into the east to take over like where Israel, Lebanon is. And they think that Napoleon had this idea to create a Jewish state, believe it or not. Something he was kind of thinking about maybe doing, possibly. And anyway, he did seize a lot of those cities that are now, in base Israel, Palestine, which are Gaza, Jaffa, Haifa. He was able to take them, but apparently his forces were riddled with bubonic plague. And so they had to eventually retreat back to Egypt. And so that part of his campaign was kind of a failure in the end. But Napoleon used a lot of propaganda to make him look like he was a success in Egypt. And when he did return to France in 1799, of course, he came back a hero. But he left a lot of his men behind, who were later captured by the other side. So that's the next thing, of course, that happened. Of course, next week, which we've already talked about before about that. But as I say, in that little short video, Napoleon does seize power, of course, in 1799. The so-called, they call it the coup of 18 Brumaire, is usually what they call it, which actually occurred on November 9th, 1799. That's in, of course, the old, French Revolutionary calendar they were still using at the time in France. And so that basically, starts the so-called Age of Napoleon or Napoleonic Era. That'll go for like 14, 15 years, up to about 1815. And a lot of people view Napoleon's seizure to take control of the French, state as being really the thing that really ends the revolution. Napoleon once said that I am the revolution. So they do think it kind of keeps going after that because they have several revolutions later, in France in 1800s. But he did kind of view himself as being like almost like part of the revolution and the end of it, what happens after that. So Napoleon takes power. Of course, he wasn't supposed to be the main man in power. He had these other men like Roger Ducos, Abbe Sieyès, of course, that was in there. But he kind of pushes them aside because he's got, military power that he does. And so they have a period that's from about 1799 to 1804, where they have what they call the consulate or French consulate that comes in. And that's where Napoleon rules as first consul of France, which was like this chief magistrative position that was obviously influenced by the Romans. The ancient Romans had what they call consuls, that magistrates that ran the state and all that. So that was kind of the idea of where he got the idea from, like Julius Caesar and all these others that had consul a long time ago. And he helped to actually write the Constitution of this particular new Republican government that he puts in power. But a lot of foreign states kind of see Napoleon as a dictator, really ruling over the state. And by 1802, he was actually made consul for life, kind of like Julius Caesar, dictator for life. And then what happens in the end is that Napoleon eventually will become emperor. Is what's eventually going to happen, of course, because of that, is solidifying power and all that. Now, before I get to him becoming emperor, I did want to talk about a few things about Napoleon. Besides, being a great general, a statesman, Napoleon was also known for his reforms to France. He helped to modernize France. I think, in a sense, he helped to kind of influence later modern Europe as a whole. I'll kind of go through some of the things he was well known for overall, but here, of course, there's a bunch, of course, you can see there. One of the big things he was known for, of course, the most famous thing he did is he developed the Napoleonic Code, which was originally called the Code Napoleon, is what they call it actually. Later, it's called the Napoleonic Code. And the Napoleonic Code was a French civil law code system that was developed, of course, in France, which developed over a few years after he came to power. And it was based off of like the Age of Enlightenment and also the ideals of the French Revolution. But they do think it was heavily influenced by the Justinian Code because a lot of codes in Europe, like going back to, say, Prussia and other countries, had started to develop law code systems that were kind of similar to the old Byzantine law code systems they had, of course. And so that was considered one of his greatest things he established because a lot of countries later adopted these ideas into a lot of their constitutions. Even Louisiana, you know about this, our law code system is heavily influenced by the Napoleonic Code. That's why when you take the bar exam, you know, Louisiana, it's more difficult because of that. So he's definitely known for that, for sure. He had education reforms was another thing that Napoleon was known for as well. He created what they call lycées, which you may have heard about in France, which he established in 1801. That was like schools that they created for boys, I think it was a 7-year type school from like the age of 10 to 16. So it's like an upper level secondary type school. I guess like middle school, high school is what it would be. And at first it was only for boys, and then later for obviously for girls also as well, women. So that's something, of course, he was known for as well. Also, he created the National Bank of France. That was one thing he did, which they had a bank before, I think, under Louis XV, but it went bankrupt. And so that was something he was able to do, which helped to establish a more permanent bank, better currency, less inflation, things like that. And then the other thing he did too was he brought back in the Catholic Church, which the Jacobins had basically taken out, and he made this deal with the Catholic Church, which was called the Concordat of 1801, with Pope Pius VII of the Catholic Church in Rome. But he didn't. He said that there would be freedom of religion. So anybody wants to practice, whatever religion they want, they can do it. Napoleon was Catholic, but he wasn't really that religious. We study about Napoleon. Another thing Napoleon was known for, he did under him in France, they began to adopt the metric system, which later, if you know about it, spread to the rest of Europe. It basically replaced the British imperial system, which you know about that. It's based on things like the inch, the foot, pound, ounce, whatever. That maybe is why sometimes I think the height of Napoleon is kind of questioned sometimes. Some people think he's like real short, like 5'2", but they think Napoleon was maybe about average height, about 5'6". So it's kind of a myth that he was like real short. Also, he added something you may have heard of called the Legion of Honor. It was a type of merit system that the French developed to honor people that were great soldiers or great citizens of the country. And it involved like rewards and medals that you could get for your great success. Also had like different ranks, like 5 ranks, which the highest rank was the Grand Master, which was later held by the President of France. And the Grand Master usually wears a cross. We call it the Grand Cross, which is a type of medal. It's kind of famous. So those are the kind of things that Napoleon was kind of known for doing to France, but he helped to modernize the state. And further modernization will come later when his nephew comes in, of course, which is Emperor Napoleon III as well. All right, let me move on. Of course, the other thing that happened with Napoleon, as you know, was, like I said, he was crowned Emperor of France, which that happened on December 2nd, 1804. He was crowned in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. They usually think that begins the so-called Napoleonic Empire, which starts around 1804, goes up to about 1814 to 1815. That was a very famous event, the way. Napoleon, of course, at that event had the Pope come to kind of legitimize him and all that, which is Pope Pius VII. And he was known famously for crowning himself and then putting the crown on, his wife's head, Josephine, as Empress consort as well. And that was kind of considered controversial at the time, I guess, when that happened. But at that point, a lot of the European powers like Britain don't trust Napoleon afterwards. They also don't see him as being legitimate because of the fact that he came from lesser nobility and all that. And so Napoleon was this man that kind of rose up from basically nothing to become, the head of France. And I think he made a famous remark, which is well known about him being crowned. He said once that I found the crown of France in the gutter and I put it on my head, basically. So anyway, so he gets crowned, of course, emperor, of course, France. There, of course, is I guess the coronation or crowning of his wife too as empress consort. Like all the images, he's kind of seen as this Caesar, basically, being crowned as emperor and all that. But what's going to happen because the fact that Napoleon, comes to power, sees control of the country, it sparks a series of wars that are often referred to as being called the Napoleonic Wars, which go on for another 12 years, about 1814 to 1815. These were a series of wars where European coalitions ganged up against the Napoleonic Empire. Like several of these coalitions that were, of course, were founded at one point or another. Napoleonic Wars are some of the bloodiest wars that were fought, by the way, in modern times. If you look at the Napoleonic Wars, I think the amount of deaths are somewhere between 3 to maybe up to maybe 4 million deaths, mostly soldiers and some citizens. You don't really have any other bloody wars later like that until World War I and World War II in the 20th century, to give you an idea. And I think before that, you want a real bloody war, you got to go all the way back to maybe the 30 Years' War, to be maybe bloodier than this one was. These were all the countries that opposed the French Empire at one point: Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria, Holy Roman Empire, Sweden. I think Spain joined, a few other countries later also as well. And so most of Europe was basically arrayed against him in all these wars. And he almost won. He almost won the wars, but in the end, it was just too many countries to really he could try to stop. Kind of like what happened to Hitler later, being ganged up by multiple countries. Here's kind of an image showing you like a map of the extent, of his territories. But at one point, in the Napoleonic Wars, France basically controls territory all the way from like Spain, all the way like actually Poland and part of Russia. So it's a massive amount of territory that they control, or they have countries that are forced to be allies with them, of course, in the Napoleonic Wars. And during these wars, if you know about it, Napoleon had this really badass army that he built up, if you know, which was called the Grande Armée, which means the Great Army Napoleon, which was considered one of the first great modernized, armies in this time period, which may have peaked at close to about 800,000 troops at one point. And for a long time, it was unbeatable, for a bunch of years. Nobody could beat his armies. They also had really damn good artillery, which also helped a lot with that as well. And part of why he was able to build this army up was because in 1803, if you know about it, France under Napoleon decided to sell Louisiana, which I don't know if you know about this, back in 1800, he had talked the Spanish into selling Louisiana to the French. They actually got it back. But what happened was Haiti had this slave revolt they had that broke out, I think around 1801, Haitian Revolution. They lost it. They lost Haiti. And so when Haiti was lost, they didn't really have any other islands or territories that they could control, I guess, in that area. So they decided to sell it to the United States. He didn't want to give it to Britain. So he decided to give it to the United States instead under Thomas Jefferson. And so the United States gave Napoleon $15 million for it, which right there. And you can see it doubled the size of the United States at that time. Also gave them practically total control of the Mississippi River as well, which is important for their trade and all that later. So that was all why he was able to do that eventually. Now, Napoleon would have to fight a lot of, campaigns, of course, against the opposing side. They have like these two wars that break out between 1803 to 1807, which are the wars of the Third Coalition, and they also have the War of the Fourth Coalition, which, by the way, included a failed invasion of Britain, which happened in 1805. I'll get to Austerlitz in a second. Austerlitz was considered one of the most famous battles associated with that time period, but they did have a deal where Napoleon had this idea to invade what is England. And I think at first he was going to try to maybe dig a canal under the English Channel, kind of like they got now, that goes between England, France, and had ideas like use hot air balloons maybe to get over to the other side. But he came up with this other idea, which was to combine the Spanish fleet. Spain was kind of allied with the French at that time. So they tried to combine their forces to invade England, like wipe out the British fleet and maybe take England. But the British fleet was just too powerful. And at the Battle of Trafalgar, which happened on October 21st, 1805, Horatio Nelson's fleet practically defeated the Franco-Spanish fleet, which is actually a little larger than theirs, capturing about or destroying about 23, like 2/3 of their ships were either captured or destroyed in the battle. Nelson became, if you know about this, a household name because of that. He was actually mortally wounded in the battle, died afterwards. But now if you go to England today, they have what they call Trafalgar Square, which is named after him today. He was considered, by the way, Nelson was considered like one of the greatest naval commanders, of the Napoleonic Wars overall. So Napoleon at that time really realized that he wasn't going to be able to do that, try to invade England. And so one of the things he decided to do, if you know about this, was Napoleon decided to basically invade Austria. That's what he does next. Go into Austria, War of the Third Coalition, and that leads into a kind of a campaign period that is called the Ulm Campaign, where the Grand Army marches into Austrian Empire at that point. And like a 3-week period between September to October, Napoleon's forces were able to trap like the main Austrian force and actually take Vienna, which is the capital of Austria, by November. And so you see at that point, that leads into what is the Battle of Austerlitz. And what happened was Russia, who was allied with Austria, the Austrian Empire, they decided to bring in forces to try to stop Napoleon and combine their forces together into like a large-sized army. And so they combined their force. I think their force was like close to about 90,000 troops they had, and they engaged Napoleon, who had a smaller army, in now what is called the Czech Republic today, near a village or city called Austerlitz, hence the name being used. And the battle had a nickname. It was later called the Battle of the Three Emperors, because of the fact that on both sides you had combined three emperors that were basically all three states. Napoleon, Emperor of France. You had the other ones were France II, who was the Emperor of Austria. And you had the Tsar of Russia, which was Emperor Alexander I. So these were these sides that were there involved in the battle. And even though Napoleon's forces were like a smaller force, Napoleon was able to trick the Russians, who I think were kind of fooled by Napoleon at the battle. They basically tricked him into thinking that the main attack was going to come like on the flank, like an oblique order attack, like Frederick the Great had talked about before and designed. But the real attack came in the center, and it led to a rout. And so the Russian-Austrian forces at Austerlitz suffered something like 30, I think it was 30-some thousand were killed or wounded or captured in the battle. And the French had low casualties. Like a lot of the early battles, the French have very low casualties compared to the coalition side. And so this victory, at Austerlitz was considered to be Napoleon's greatest battle that he won in. And to commemorate the battle, he later, afterwards, if you know, in Paris, started building the Arc de Triomphe, which later was built to really symbolize and honor those, soldiers that had died, in the Napoleonic Wars and all of that. And it is known for having like a tomb of the unknown soldier in France, which a lot of countries started to do in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I think it took them years to build it. I think it wasn't finished like the 1830s or whatever, but that actual victory arch was built really to honor Napoleon's victory at Austerlitz. Now, the defeat of Austria, by the way, is one thing that happened was it led to the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, and so Emperor Francis had to basically renounce his title to the throne, and I think after that he became known as Emperor Francis I of the Austrian Empire instead. And the other thing he did, he started creating all these buffer states. I don't know if you know about this in Europe, but there's one he created called the Confederation of the Rhine that was built in Western Germany. And he starts putting these buffer states all over in Europe to kind of prevent, I guess, other states from invading him. And so, yeah, if they're not like, a state that's, allied with them, it's a state he creates to kind of, prevent invasion. But he also put a lot of his relatives on the throne. Like they had one later called the Kingdom of Westphalia, which was in Western Germany. He put his brother Jerome on the throne. And later he tried to put his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain as well. So he was known for a lot of nepotism, Napoleon. After that, they kept going. If you know about that, the Napoleonic Wars, and after Trafalgar and all that, that just didn't work. They had other victories that came later, which were in the War of the Fourth Coalition that they had. They had the Battle of, it's actually two battles, which were the Battle of Jena, the Battle of Auerstedt, which happened in October 1806. And so Napoleon from Austria invaded northward into Prussia, and Frederick de William III's armies were just routed in both those battles with very, very high casualties for their side. And Prussia will not really be a threat to, the French state until 1813. They're knocked out of the war for a bunch of years after that. Austria is too. Austria doesn't really come back to the war until 1813 as well. And so the only thing left is really Russia. And so he pushes his forces eastward into, I think, East Prussia, like what is kind of like used to be northern part of Poland at one point. It's now where Kaliningrad is actually today. And Napoleon's forces fought what is Alexander again at the Battle of Friedland, which happened in June of 1807. His forces were routed also as well. And so that effectively ended the whole War of the Fourth Coalition pretty quickly. So Napoleon defeated these powers in really what is really just less than 2 years. It was very quick campaigns, and the Grand Army was just unbeatable. Nobody could really mess with it at that time. Now, they did have a series of treaties that were kind of created afterwards, which were known as the so-called Peace of Tilsit, which came out in July of 1807. These were a series of treaties between France and what is Russia and Prussia, those two countries, ending effectively the Fourth Coalition War. Only Britain stood again, to fight Napoleon, in these wars, basically. In Russia, Prussia, countries like that, also Austria, were forced to be allies of France at that time. Like I said, Napoleon started putting in all these buffer states all over the place. Like here's some they had. He also put in after that, after 1807, Kingdom of Westphalia was added, which was like in Western Germany. Duchy of Warsaw was a Polish state that he created because Napoleon thought that the Poles needed their own country as well. There was also the Free City of Danzig was also created by Napoleon as well. But pretty much Tilsit And those early Napoleonic wars, right, they have right there, helped to really cement Napoleon's power, especially in Central Europe, at that time between Russia and France. So he's pretty much unbeatable at that point. Now, the only thing about Napoleon is that his empire, is going to collapse. That's one thing about it. It doesn't last long. It only lasts a few years, the so-called Napoleonic Empire, and then it starts falling apart. And of course, there's a lot of different causes of why the Napoleonic Empire, of course, fell apart within just a few years. Of course, I'll get to it, of course, next, which we'll talk about. I'll kind of get into some of the cause of why this, of course, happened. There's one thing he did do starting around 1807, 1808, which became very famous. Like I said, Britain was the only country he couldn't, defeat because, Britain had their powerful naval power that they had. And so he came up with this thing called the Continental System. And Continental System was this idea to put blockades, embargoes on the British Empire so that basically nobody could trade with them. And so the idea was to destroy Britain economically. They could destroy, what he called the workshop of the world for the British Empire. He thought that then he could basically be able to defeat him. And so other countries, couldn't trade with him, trade with the British and all that. And if they did, he would try to stop them from doing that. And so a lot of allies or dependent states, couldn't trade with the British. They do think that the Continental System helped to cause the War of 1812. If you know about this, between the United States and Great Britain, and apparently the Americans were trying to trade with France. That's the only thing about that. But the British didn't want to trade, and so they would often stop our ships on the high seas. And so they started actually impressing a lot of Americans into the British Navy. And so the United States got angry about this and declared war on the British, which lasted 1812 to 1815. That war didn't go well for us. If you know about the United States, we got invaded by the British. They actually attacked Washington, D.C. and burned down the White House. I think they burned down the Congress building too, or part of it as well. But later we repulsed them. I know that. And then they tried to invade Louisiana, New Orleans, in January of 1815. But Andrew Jackson stopped them. You know about that, for the Battle of New Orleans. So we did kind of get revenge later. But it's amazing how, they were able to fight us and they were fighting Napoleon at the same time. So that's pretty impressive. Now, the other thing that also they talk about too, that was kind of a cause of why the Napoleonic Empire declined, was the so-called Peninsular War that was going on, that broke out starting in 1808. That was a major conflict where Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula. I think he first invaded and tried to attack the Portuguese and then also the Spanish. He even tried to put his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Spain, which angered a lot of the Spanish. And so it started this major conflict, which will last 6 years, 1808 to 1814. And it became like mostly a guerrilla war where the Spanish and the Portuguese were backed by the British. And that's when the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, known as Sir Arthur Wellesley, started going in there, and he helped aid like Spain and Portugal in the war against Napoleon. And I think the Spanish later called him the British leopard, the leopard. So they called him. And crazy thing about the Peninsular War was it sparked all these Latin American revolutions that occur afterwards. And because of the fact that I guess the monarchs that were in power there were, I think the Portuguese monarch had to flee to Brazil at one point. And I think the traditional monarchs weren't in power, and the Bourbons. And so basically you had a deal where all the states rebelled, all the colonies they had, and they start forming their own states, like Mexico, and Argentina, Brazil, all these other countries that formed afterwards in the early 19th century because of Napoleon. So Napoleon helped to kind of create a lot of this nationalism throughout Latin America as well. That was kind of important because Napoleon lost a lot of troops, fighting, like up to 300,000 were lost, fighting in this guerrilla war. And so it kind of helped to create multiple fronts. He had to fight and all that. Of course, the other thing that Napoleon, the thing that really killed his whole empire, if you know about that, is his invasion of Russia, which occurred in 1812. And they believe that why Napoleon invaded Russia, it wasn't like Hitler. Hitler was kind of saw, the Soviet Union as a territory to conquer, live and strom, and add territory to the Third Reich, and all that. But the reason why Napoleon invaded Russia was because of the fact that the Russians had basically violated the Peace of Tilsit, where they had been aligned with them. They were violating the continental system as well. They were trying to trade with the British, and so he wanted to go in there and force them to basically adhere to that particular treaty. And so that led to one of the largest invasions in history, where they think as large as maybe 600,000 troops may have been involved. The main army had about 400,000 that he had, but he also used a lot of mercenaries that he went with into Russia, which include like Poles and Germans and others in his armies. A lot of them didn't really want to fight, because I think a lot of them were kind of forced into it, drafted throughout Europe. And so June 1812, his forces, of course, invaded. Now, the Russians, what they did in response, they basically used a form of like scorched earth policies, like they burned a lot of their crops, tried to destroy any kind of buildings that they could live in. And they used guerrilla warfare against them. Also, Cossack soldiers, which were mostly Ukrainian type soldiers in Russia, also would harass them later as well. And his invasion of Russia was really a nightmare for him because logistically he had to supply all these men. And most of the time, if you study about it, they were actually trying to forage for food, because Napoleon once said that an army usually walks on its stomach. It needs, food or whatever supplies to basically, live. And they had that very difficult to do that. Russia was a very poor area of Europe, and so it was very difficult to do it. And when the Russian winter came in, it made it worse on top of that. In the Russian campaign, the Battle of Borodino was considered really to be the bloodiest battle of the whole campaign. He does eventually take Moscow, which he will. It's kind of a Pyrrhic victory for Napoleon at high cost, basically. But he's able to take Moscow, but Alexander, the ruler of Russia, refuses to make peace with him. Doesn't want to adhere to the Peace of Tilsit. And so Napoleon at that time was basically forced to retreat back to Poland. So October to November, he begins retreating back to basically towards Central Europe. And that's when the rest of his forces are basically lost. A lot of his men, of course, starve. They freeze to death, or they're captured or harassed by Cossack soldiers as they try to make a mass retreat. Here's kind of a graph showing you the size of Napoleon's army as it started in the beginning. You can see entering from Poland into Russia. You can see how over time it shrinks as they get to Moscow, and then you can see as it goes back towards Poland, it's practically almost wiped out in the actual battles and invasion. And there's a lot of images showing, Napoleon riding a horse and looking miserable like his other men, but a lot of that was propaganda. Actually, I think they usually rode around on a sleigh with him. He got 3 meals a day, as all his other men were practically starving or freezing to death overall. And so they do think that the invasion, of Russia, all these battles that he fought in Russia, pretty much helped to seal the deal with his empire later. By the way, the invasion of Russia in 1812 was the bloodiest conflict of the whole Napoleonic Wars. They think both sides suffered combined about 900,000 almost 1 million people were killed, wounded, were captured during that conflict. That pales in comparison to World War II on the Eastern Front. Eastern Front was one of the worst military campaigns in history. I think it was like 30 million dead on both sides. With I think the Russians had like 20 million dead at least in that. But considered one of the bloodiest conflicts, and especially because the winter was real severe. Apparently, 1812, 1813. Right now, Napoleon. So at that point, he's defeated, and so what occurs is the European side then forms a new coalition against him. So-called War of the Sixth Coalition, of course, starts 1813 to 1815, and you get all these powers that basically decide to fight Napoleon that were kind of like out of the war at that time. And so in October 1813, there's a pitched battle that's real famous that was in at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which was the Battle of Leipzig, which they later called the Battle of Nations because so many countries were involved, and like 5 different countries were actually involved in the battle. Russia, Austria, Prussia, Sweden fielded 4 armies against Napoleon's forces. He was outnumbered almost 2 to 1 in the battle. And Battle of Nations was considered, by the way, one of the largest battles in European history. This is like before World War I. You have to go up to I think the First Battle of Marne before you get battles that are bigger than this here. It was one of the largest battles, and Napoleon's forces almost got encircled. They almost got wiped out in the battle, but his men were able to escape. But Leipzig is very important because Leipzig, they think, is the battle that really leads to the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire. Because by the spring, Napoleon's country gets invaded, and eventually the coalition troops under Emperor Alexander I enter Paris by April of 1814. Pretty much it's over for Napoleon's empire at that time. What happens to Napoleon? Well, Napoleon at that point is sent into exile. That's kind of what it looks like, I guess, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and all that. But he's sent to Elba, island of Elba, which is off the coast of Italy, not that far from where actually Corsica is. In fact, I think they passed Corsica on the way there, that little tiny island, which is close to Tuscany in Naples. Actually, it's not above; it's above that. It's actually Tuscany. Naples is on the bottom of Italy. But he's sent there in exile, which he's there for, I think, about 10 months. He's there, and as Napoleon is in exile, they pretty much think he's not going to come back. At that point, the European powers at that time have this famous meeting where they decide, the fate of, post-Napoleon Europe at that time. And they have this huge diplomatic conference, which lasts between 1814 and 1815 in trying to, redo the whole political order of Europe after Napoleon, turned it on its head at that time. The Congress of Vienna was headed up by this man named Prince von Metternich, or Clemens von Metternich, who you see on the right. He was kind of the host of it, basically. And you can see it was held between November of 1814 to June of 1815. The conference is called all kinds of names: Vienna Settlement, the Concert of Europe, overall. And Metternich had a bunch of goals. One, he wanted to basically prevent the French from really having a lot of too much power afterwards. And so he wanted to build up all the European countries around them to have a balance of power so they could have peace in Europe, which they do for close to almost 100 years afterwards. So he wants a balance of power in Europe. He also wanted to restore all the European monarchs to their thrones, like in France, etc., and also restore a lot of boundaries of Europe, which Napoleon had kind of redrawn as well. Oh, another thing too, one thing that they did, they brought in conservatism back. And so they wanted to stop the spread of liberalism, radical ideas that the French Revolution and Napoleon helped to spread in Europe. And so these are things that kind of Metternich helps to influence later. And so the period after we know about this, Napoleon is often called the Age of Metternich. It's one of the things you've probably heard about before and all that. And I'll get to it later, but they put the king of France back in. They put the Bourbons are put back in at that point. Overall, it's one of the biggest things, I guess, that happened at that point in France was they brought back the Bourbon dynasty. King Louis XVIII, who was a younger brother of Louis XVI, was put in power, and he's going to be in power until 1824. So you got the Bourbon Restoration. It's one of the biggest things that happened after they ousted Napoleon. There was a Louis XVII, but he was the son of Louis XVI that died in prison during the French Revolution. Bourbons counted him as kind of like he was king because they didn't really accept the idea that there was a revolution or that Napoleon even existed. They kind of acted like he wasn't there, that kind of thing. And there's another thing, I'll get to it later, probably not now, but there's something that was very famous that came out of the whole Congress of Vienna. They had this thing that was created called the German Confederation, and it was created to replace the Holy Roman Empire. They didn't bring it back after that. And it was a federation of German states. They were in those purple borders that you can see in that map. And I think the countries that were big in it were like Austria, Prussia, Bavaria. Those are the main kingdoms that were part of it that were there. And the German Confederation is important later because it's seen as the precursor to the German nation that they'll have later, like Germany that we know today. But later on, it's weakened. It has Austria and Prussia, which are the two biggest powers. But the rivalry between those countries later, especially in the late 1800s, pretty much kills the idea of that. And Germany is going to actually, Prussia, that state, is going to be the one that's going to actually create Germany itself. It did have a capital, which was at Frankfurt. It did have a parliamentarian diet, which was called the Federal Convention, but it didn't really have a lot of real power overall. But later on, Prussia will form it into a real viable state, which will be the German Empire. Now, the only thing is, Napoleon, like I said, was in exile. If you know about, like I said, he was on Elba at that time. He was kind of antsy. He wasn't really happy about, being in exile. And so in 1850, Napoleon decided to return to France, which he did, to restore the French Empire. And so Napoleon comes back for about 3 or 4 months, a period often called the so-called 100 Days, where he's emperor a second time between March to June of 1815. And Napoleon's got to raise an army like real fast at that point. And so what he decides to do, Napoleon, he decides to invade Belgium to go after coalition forces that are there, which are mostly British under the Duke of Wellington. There's also some Prussian forces that are there under von Blücher, who was a famous general of theirs at the time. And so that leads to a very pivotal battle, which was called the Battle of Waterloo, which was fought in central Belgium, which Napoleon's forces mostly fought the British under the Duke of Wellington, who was often called the Iron Duke. Wellington was considered one of the most famous British generals in the war. He was more of a defensive general, which played kind of into his hands at Waterloo. Here's kind of an image of what the Waterloo battlefield looked like. By the way, it happened on June 18th, 1815. You can see the date right there. But there's the actual battlefield, which I think was like some kind of wheat field or something that was there in Belgium. Anyway, during the battle, Napoleon, Wellington had the high ground. He had a big advantage over Napoleon. Napoleon tried to basically attack Wellington's center. He first tried to use cavalry charges up the middle, but Wellington had cleverly put his forces into like squares to repulse, cavalry, basically. And then when Napoleon used his infantry, especially the Imperial Guard, which was like his crack troops, they basically retreated. And after that, it became a mass rout. And so Waterloo, the term Waterloo later became a term for basically a massive defeat. And so within days after that, Napoleon abdicated the throne again, and he went permanently into exile. This time, the British wanted to make sure that Napoleon did not come back, by the way. So they sent him to this island, of course, off the coast of Africa, island of St. Helena, which you see there. I think it was like a volcanic island, which the British used as like a port to stop off between South Africa, halfway up the western coast of Africa towards Britain. And he's forced to live there for like 5.5 years, between 1815 to 1821. So he's permanently exiled there forever. And he later dies on the island, May 5th, 1821. He often quarreled with the main commander of the island. I think they refused to actually call him emperor. They would call him like General Bonaparte, but they wouldn't call him emperor, which really made him mad. And he was forced to live in this house. You see there, they later call it Longwood, which was actually a converted cattle barn that they made into a house. It's kind of sad about that. That's the last place where he lived his whole life, Napoleon. And he died at the age of 51. Napoleon, he was only 51 years old, 1821. And there's a lot of controversies about his death. They seem to think that from the autopsy that he died of stomach cancer, which his father did too as well. But there are actually rumors that he may have been poisoned. I think there was a famous, it was a dentist later that studied it later and said that it may have been arsenic that was used to poison Napoleon. So some people think that maybe Napoleon was poisoned. So it's kind of interesting about the end life, of course, of Napoleon. What about Napoleon's legacy? Well, Napoleon, has got a long legacy. That's one thing about Napoleon. He is this kind of figure that a lot of people look up to, especially in France. France, he's seen as a famous, national hero overall. He's also seen as this man that helped to modernize Europe, overall, kind of make it a, real modernized, region, because he got people to believe in nationalism and things like that. Also, his legal codes helped to modernize countries and things like that. But he is seen as a controversial figure because of the fact that, these wars he spawned, killed so many people, but he's definitely not like Hitler. Hitler, doesn't have a good legacy now, obviously, because of what happened with the Holocaust. But people don't see that with Napoleon today. He's seen as this man of the people, I guess, now, overall. So now next week, I'm going to, of course, be moving on to talk about, the rise of nationalism, imperialism, things like that. We'll kind of get into as well. We'll also talk about things like, the 19th century. We can have all these new countries that kind of form, like Germany, Italy. So we'll get into that. I'll also talk about what happens in France and Russia and some of those other countries after the Napoleonic Wars as well. So I'll probably start on that first overall. So before I go, don't forget we have assignments out there. I did give you a new assignment on the Enlightenment Scientific Revolution. So that's going to be due later. But if you have any comments, questions, of course, about this lecture on Napoleon, please let me know about that, or you can send me, of course, comments also as well. So that's it pretty much for the week overall. I hope y'all have a great weekend, of course, coming up. And of course, I'll see you, of course, next week as well. So y'all take care and have a great, pretty much rest of the week. So y'all take care.